If you're in an intercity express train travelling through a tunnel in the German state of Thuringia, you'd better hope that the train doesn't catch fire, because if recent events are anything to go by, it could be hours before you can be rescued, if at that point you're even still alive. Fortunately, this is extremely unlikely ever to actually happen. This is the story of an exercise to simulate a disaster using a train that isn't actually on fire and 100 volunteers playing injured passengers. One of the points of this kind of exercise is to test the whole system and identify any problems that need to be fixed before it happens for real. And boy, did they find some problems. The exercise took place on Saturday, the 8th of August, in a tunnel near the tiny town of Stadtilm on the main high-speed line between Erfurt and Nuremberg. A real ICE train with 100 people on board was driven into the tunnel and powered down. The driver was then to make an emergency call, and everyone was to act as if the incident was real and the train was on fire. This scenario tested several things all at once. First, the driver had to get a message out from a powered-down train in the middle of a tunnel to the train dispatcher. This then had to be relayed to a central emergency services dispatch centre, which in turn had to alert local dispatch centres who could alert the emergency services. And this being a major incident in a rural area, emergency services from several places had to coordinate their response, get to the train, get the pretend passengers out, and give them first aid for their pretend injuries. At this point, I should reassure nervous train passengers that this scenario is very nearly impossible. For a modern train to come to a stop in the middle of a long tunnel, something very sudden and very catastrophic must have taken place. A simple fire breaking out almost certainly wouldn't do it. Some of you may remember the video I made a few months back when I rode a heritage train, and at one point I had to get to my seat, sit down and stay there while the train went through a tunnel. That's because the train was not equipped with modern emergency brakes that can be overridden by the driver. If anyone had pulled the emergency brake, the train would simply have stopped. And that would have been dangerous inside a long tunnel. Instead, the driver needs to be able to override the emergency brake and bring the train to a stop at a designated place where passengers can be safely evacuated and met by emergency services. If you've ever looked out of the window while riding a train in Germany, you may have seen these distance markers. If these markers have orange reflective strips above and below, it means that you're on a stretch of line with either a long tunnel or a long viaduct where only trains with an activated override system are allowed. Our train had to get special permission to use that tunnel on condition that all passengers remained seated and every carriage had a guard in radio contact with the driver. So in a real-life situation, the train would almost certainly not have stopped until it had reached a designated rescue point. But almost certainly not does not mean the same as never. So even though the risk is incredibly tiny, it's still worth preparing for. So what happened? Well, the railway dispatcher got the emergency message from the driver just fine, but it was another 30 minutes before that message got through to the emergency services dispatcher, and apparently another 30 minutes before the fire brigades were alerted. According to most reports, it was 2 hours after the driver first sent the distress call that the emergency services actually arrived on the scene. Local authorities dispute that, though, and say that first responders were there within 35 minutes. And just to make things even worse, the emergency services couldn't get the train doors open. There is a mechanism that should allow them to get the doors open even when the train is powered down, but for some reason that didn't work properly. It will take a little while for an investigation to discover exactly why everything went so horribly wrong, but there are some details that we already know that might help shed light on the problem. Several media reports about the incident have highlighted the use of fax to get the message through, and the local district administrator has heavily criticised the use of such outdated technology. The Thuringian Interior Ministry has said that fax is used by Deutsche Bahn to send details of the incident to the emergency services dispatcher and for local dispatchers to request support from other dispatch centres. But actually alerting the emergency services is always done by radio. Obviously, local politicians are very loudly calling for the replacement of fax by more reliable digital technologies. But apparently, at least according to what I've read, Thuringia is ahead of the politicians on this one. A step-by-step transition is in fact in the works. In any case, there was apparently a technical issue somewhere along the chain of communication that wasn't immediately discovered because Unfortunately, as the exercise was taking place, emergency services were dealing with a couple of real emergencies, including 2 serious accidents on the Autobahn. Not that this excuses the embarrassing failure, but it did make things worse. Obviously, real emergencies with real injuries had to take priority over 100 bored actors, so the communications problems weren't noticed quickly enough, and the emergency services were delayed because they were busy with other things. At this stage, it's probably a bit too soon to start drawing firm conclusions about exactly what happened and how to fix it, but one observation that caught my eye came from the Interior Minister of Thuringia himself, Georg Meyer. He pointed to an issue that has been criticised before: how civil protection in general is organised in Germany. In Germany, this is done at the municipal level, which makes sense for things like fires and localised chemical spills. Not so much when it comes to 100 people trapped in a burning train. Well, to be more realistic, several hundred people trapped inside a burning train. In this fictitious scenario, with just 100 passengers on board, the train was practically empty. Normally, a train of this type would be expected to carry closer to 500. But because of the fragmented nature of civil protection, responses to large events can be very difficult. To be sure, there is nothing stopping municipalities from working closely together, pooling resources and centralising coordination. And in some places, that's exactly what happens, and it can work quite well. But this isn't the case in Thuringia, where attempts by municipalities to centralise and coordinate have failed, in many cases apparently simply because they just couldn't agree on anything. One report about such a case that I read talked about irreconcilable differences, which made it sound like a divorce. Related to that is the issue that Thuringia is currently covered by 12 separate emergency service dispatch centres and is apparently trying to consolidate them into a much more manageable 4 or 5. That would certainly make coordination and communication a lot easier. To be sure, many reports that I've read of the incident have talked of a technical defect, which doesn't sound like the kind of problem that can be solved by a little reorganisation. Unless, of course, the technical difficulties have something to do with different independently operating dispatch centres using incompatible systems. The problem, though, is that there may not be a great deal that the state government can do to make the necessary changes. Since civil protection is a matter for the municipalities, the state government may not be able to force a reorganisation. The German political system takes the principle of federalism very seriously indeed, and that is down to what happened in the 1930s. In order to properly consolidate their grip on power, the Nazi regime forced states and municipalities into conformity, effectively stripping them of all their autonomy. That way, they couldn't oppose the national government. So in modern-day Germany, once some area of responsibility has been delegated to state or local government, it is nearly impossible for a higher level of government to actually regulate it. Any attempt to do that will immediately be criticised as overreach and probably ruled unconstitutional. This is one of the facts that hampered the German government's response to the COVID pandemic. Public health is a matter for the states, so all the Chancellor could do was to plead with the 16 state leaders to agree on a plan of action, but there was nothing she could do to stop them just ignoring their agreement and doing their own things. And now, Meyer might be in a similar position, having to plead with mayors to resolve their differences and set up a modern system to be used by all the municipalities. On the face of it then, it seems to me as if there was a breakdown in communications and a series of unfortunately timed real emergencies that diverted the response away from the exercise. So it may be that actually not much really did go wrong, but it still amounted to one huge pig's breakfast. Hopefully the root causes can be found and everyone involved finds the will to actually fix them. Meanwhile, we can be very glad that these issues were discovered during an exercise and not a real disaster. Thank you for watching, and if you're interested in the historic train journey that I mentioned earlier in the video, you can watch it if you click down there.